Welcome to Diffused Congruence. This is episode 42 of the American Muslim Experience. My name is Zaki Hassan, and with me once again is Pervez Ahmed.
Yes, welcome everyone. Welcome back, and good to have you back. And so, yeah, we had a great conversation last time with Shadi Hamid, and sort of continuing our connections to Georgetown University. Super excited with the guests that we have today. I've been wanting to have our guest on for quite some time, so I'm very excited about this.
Well, and we're joined this week by Jonathan Brown, who is the Al-Walid bin Talal Chair of Islamic Civilization in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and he's the director of the Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. He received his BA in History from Georgetown in 2000 and his doctorate in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago in 2006. Dr. Brown has studied and conducted research in countries such as Egypt, Syria, Turkey, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, South Africa, India, Indonesia, and Iran. His book publications include The Canonization of Al-Bukhari and Muslim, The Formalization and Function of the Sunni Hadith Canon, Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World, and Muhammad, A Very Short Introduction, which was selected for the National Endowment for the Humanities Bridging Cultures Muslim Journeys bookshelf. And his most recent book, Misquoting Muhammad, The Challenges and Choices of Interpreting the Prophet's Legacy, was named one of the top books on religion of 2014 by The Independent. He's published articles in the fields of Hadith, Islamic law, Salafism, Sufism, Arabic lexical theory, and pre-Islamic poetry, and is the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam and Law. Dr. Brown's current research interests include Islamic legal reform and a translation of Sahih al-Bukhari. Dr. Brown, thank you so much for coming on Diffused Congruence with us.
Thanks for inviting me.
I should point out to our listeners, in addition to sort of the connection to Georgetown, I was remiss to not mention you are joined also on this show by alums from University of Chicago, namely Dr. Umar Farouk Abdullah and Dr. Ingrid Mattson. So I forgot to make that connection. And like Shadi, who was our last guest, you and I first met back in Egypt, and it was circa 2006, I believe. I don't know, we spent some time in Cairo. I don't know if you remember those days.
Yeah, of course I do.
Thank you. And it was great. It was great meeting you. I think at that time, and we'll get into this, but I think that was sort of your second long stint in Cairo, correct?
Yeah, exactly. That was a great time for me. I learned a lot, and it was a very formative period for my education.
Wonderful. And we'd love to get into that, certainly. We'd love to sort of maybe start off before that time. I mean, certainly, we'd love to hear about sort of your, as I often ask, your origin story, how it all sort of began and where you grew up, and perhaps also kind of talking about your journey to Islam.
Boy, you guys... So you really want to hear about that? I mean, I hesitate only because, I think I wrote something about that years and years. Probably the first thing I ever wrote back when I don't even think, I think like the internet was still relatively new. But it's probably somewhere online called I did not choose the title, just to be clear. I don't like the title. It's obnoxious, but it's called From WASP to Muslim, like from white Anglo-Saxon Protestant to Muslim. So if you Google Jonathan Brown and then that, you'll probably find that. And it's a much, much better version than I could give. But I'll just, since you really want to know,
I'll
tell you.
Before then, yeah, you can start off.
I'm actually from Washington, D.C. originally. Well, I shouldn't say that. I'm from the suburbs of Washington, D.C. I'm from a suburb called Chevy Chase, which is it's pretty much a really wealthy white suburb of a city that's really horribly racially divided. So, I had pretty much zero interaction with anybody who was not wealthy white person or sort of international global elite, kids whose parents worked at the World Bank and happened to be from Turkey, but, who were culturally no different from me as far as I could tell. Anyway, so that's where I grew up. And I don't mean to criticize my upbringing. I had a very great childhood and my parents were wonderful parents. So I have no complaints. I was very privileged, thank God. I had no problems.
Right.
And I went to college at Georgetown. Well, actually, I went to high school in California. I should mention that first. My dad wanted me to go to boarding school to build character because he also went to boarding school.
Right.
And so he liked this boarding school in California a lot called Thatcher, which is a great school. I mean, I really liked it. But he sent me there. I didn't want to go, but he sent me. And I enjoyed it a lot. And actually, weird connection, it's in this small town in California called Ojai, Ojai.
Yeah.
And it's also where Hamza Yusuf went to high school. He didn't go to high school at Thatcher. He went to high school called Ojai Valley School, which is the lesser high school the lesser boarding school in that town. So that's a weird. I mean, nobody else knows where Ojai is except me and Hamza Yusuf, as far as I can tell. And it's really. Also, it's in the Steven Seagal movie Hard to Kill.
Oh.
If you've ever seen the movie,
Yeah.
He retreats there after he comes out of his coma when he's being nursed by Kelly LeBrock. Anyway.
So
No, you're
Ojai
not
is
here.
where you convalesce, basically.
Yeah, if you care about what's a good movie. So then anyway, what happened? Oh yeah, I went to high school at Georgetown. College. I meant college. And then I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to say. It was so long ago. It's hard for me to remember.
No.
My family was Episcopalian Christians, but my dad was the only one who was particularly practicing. And he died recently, God rest his soul. I actually don't, to this day, I don't really understand what his religious identification, I mean, in the sense, I don't really understand what his religion meant to him, except that somehow it meant something. I'm not really sure what it meant, but we went to church every Sunday, and I was acolyte. I carried the cross and stuff, and I helped the minister, prepare the communion. And of course, we got communion first, which was great because I love the wine. I was definitely going to be some kind of alcoholic, that's for sure. I really liked alcohol a lot. Anyway, so that was whatchamacallit. Oh yeah, so then but then by the time I got into college, I had a lot of existential angst. I had almost debilitating existential angst in high school. I just couldn't deal with my own mortality. I mean, to put it lightly, I don't want to sound dramatic or anything. Like I said, I didn't have any real problems, so it's not like I was, Syrian refugee or something like that. I mean, I had. But anyway, by the time I got to start at university, my brain was really revving. It's just revving hard. I remember the whole summer, again, just to show you how easy my life was. The summer between high school and college, I don't think I did anything. I'm not sure I did a single productive thing that summer, which is really weird. I mean, I don't know anybody who would be that lazy nowadays. Anyway, so I basically I read the whole summer. And I remember one of the things I read all the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. And I really I just remember they got my brain revving really hard. When I started university, I was just so eager to learn. I know it sounds cheesy. I was so eager to learn. I was so eager to think. And so I started taking, at Georgetown, which is it's a Jesuit school, so you have to take 2 religion classes over your course of your 4 years. So the first one I took was Intro to Biblical Literature. And I thought that was really interesting. But I had never really been committed Christian. I don't think I really understood the religion very well, which is probably the fault of my Sunday school teachers. So then but then a second class I took was Intro to Islamic Thought and Practice, my second semester of my freshman year. And that class really obviously captivated me. And I just got so interested in Islam and learning everything I could about it. And then, I don't know, I guess by the end of that summer after my freshman year, I decided to become Muslim, I guess. I mean, I don't go back and, I don't know, there's probably a lot of drama in there and everything, but that's the long story. And so I made that choice, and it was interesting. It was an interesting choice to make because I think I'm very grateful that I was afforded this chance at that time in my life because I made the choice without any consideration of consequence at all. And I think there's very few moments in one's life when one can make a choice without thinking about the consequences, and that was one of them for me. But I mean, so I think, if I were now in that position, I mean, I'd have probably a non-Muslim wife and non-Muslim kids and non-Muslim friends and all this stuff, and then I would choose to do that, and I'm not sure how much of that would stick with me. But I mean, I'm very, as the years gone by, I've become more and more appreciative of my friends, who almost none of whom stopped being friends with me because I became Muslim, and I think they actually put up with a lot of probably stuff they considered to be really weird, and I think it makes me. I should probably go and try and thank these guys, but I've become more and more appreciative of the way they. I actually don't know if I would have been able to put up with that. Anyway.
How about the response at home? I mean, like, what was your?
Oh, my family was very happy. I think. Well, they were. My dad, God rest his soul, he always used to say that becoming Muslim was the best thing that I ever did, because I think I was really not. I was really not in good shape before that. I mean, I don't want to. Again, I wasn't a Syrian refugee, and I wasn't, a serial drug user or, in and out of prison or something. I mean, I think I just had a lot of emotion, a lot of anxiety, and I really wasn't functioning very well in my life, I'd say. I mean, I still excelled in my studies, but I was just a very unhappy person, I think. And so when I became Muslim, a lot of that went away. And my parents were very happy about that. I became a much better son. I became a much better brother. Anyway, so that's what happened.
And how, like, in terms of your early interactions with the Muslim community in DC, how was that?
I was so blessed, thank God. I mean, this was really when I became Muslim, I met through. So there's a guy, I don't know if you've ever come across him. His name's Carl Al-Tubgi. He teaches at Brandeis now. I think his name's Carl Sharif Al-Tubgi. He's actually half Egyptian, half French Canadian or something like that. But he also kind of became Muslim, and he had gone through that process a couple years before me, and he really took me under his wing, and a bunch of other, and sort of through him I met all these other people in the DC area. Mm-hmm. People like I'm just naming it, Mona Diab and Khaled El Gindi and this guy Mike Sanford and what's his name? Oh my God, Sven White, and this so many other people. Really, this group of some of them were converts, some of them were a lot of people were from other countries studying here. Right. And I remember my first Ramadan, and that was when Ramadan was right at the same time as Christmas vacation. So it was a party. I had so much fun. I mean, I learned so much. Every day, every iftar with these people, it was just like an intensive discussion session about Islam and issues relating to it. And I learned so much. And they were so welcoming and good to me that that was my first experience with the Muslim community. And it was just incredibly positive. And I'm very grateful for that. And I'm very thankful to those people for taking me in as they did.
Yeah, because I mean, we've had our share of people who've shared their stories with us, in terms of coming into the faith, and unfortunately, in some cases, their earliest interactions with the Muslim community aren't so positive. So it's actually it's actually refreshing to hear that. So
Muslims are nice people. I mean, come on, people are so harsh. Muslims are so hard on each other. I mean,
right, no doubt.
Anyway, I mean, there's a lot of nasty people in the world, and I haven't come across very many of them in the Muslims that I've met in my life. I'll just say that much.
Good.
So,
what, I'm just curious. When you were at Georgetown, was Professor Esposito there at the time?
He was actually, but I never took classes with him.
Interesting.
I took classes with Dr. Vole, John Vole, who then became my colleague. I took classes with Yvonne Haddad, who is currently my colleague. I took classes with a lot of other people who are currently my colleagues. But Dr. Esposito, I never took class with because he only taught one class, really, which was for people in the School of Foreign Service, and I was in the College of Arts and Sciences. And so actually I was always scared of him and intimidated by him, and I never actually met him until after I graduated. And I remember he called me to his office. He wanted to meet me. And I had probably just started grad school. And I was incredibly honored. And I think, he's a very generous person. And he's very, unlike a lot of people who sort of will mentor somebody until they use them and then kick them out, or just kick them to the curb. He really takes people and mentors them and tries to help them and promote their interests consistently and regardless of whatever benefit accrues to him. And he did that with me. I mean, he really kind of took me under his wing from an early age. And and from a distance, I mean, he would just sort of, at crucial moments, he would write a letter of recommendation, or he would, be there to give me advice. And eventually that ended up with me coming to Georgetown to teach in 2010.
Yeah, and I definitely want to talk about that. And that's one of the reasons I mentioned his name, obviously. And anyone who's sort of, not only whether you're in Islamic studies or not, but John Esposito, whether it's through his media appearances or whatever, he's just a giant in the field, and people know him. And the stories that you're sharing in terms of him being so gracious, I know a lot of undergrads who actually did take classes with him and just share the same kind of sentiment. But anyway, and obviously now you're the head, you are at the center of.
Yeah, I'm his boss.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. It's just fascinating.
I call him into my office and I make him polish my shoes and things like that. No, I don't do that, obviously, but anyway. Right.
Well, you go on to sort of you're the successor to him in terms of the position now, right? At the center for a Christian Muslim understanding, but. Yeah, and then so now you find yourself at the University of Chicago. Now, at that time, you were probably there with I'm forgetting her name.
Professor Qadi, Wadala Qadi, my advisor.
Yeah, of course. She was your advisor. Okay, got it. Mm-hmm. Dr. Omar was a legend and a thing of the past by the time you got there.
Yeah, he had left years before, but. People still talked about him, and his dissertation was, even though it's recently been published. In fact, I have it on my shelf here. I have to write a review of the book, and haven't gotten around to finishing it. But his dissertation, which had never been published, people would read his dissertation.
Yeah.
And actually, I ran into him one day when eventually I would see him with some regularity. It wasn't just one time that I met him, but I ran into him one day in the library, and I don't know if I asked him a question or if he just told me something, but he basically told me, okay, if you really want to understand Islamic law, you have to go read XYZ book. He told me about the books of Sheikh Muhammad Abu Zahra, who's an Egyptian scholar who died, I think, around 1974.
Yeah.
And and that really, I started reading those, and that was kind of the beginning of, I think, to whatever extent I've understood these things properly, it was through that beginning down that path. So he really was there again at a crucial moment in my life to help me.
Yeah. In fact, when I was in Cairo, I don't know if it was you or if it was Professor Jackson, but one of you or both of you recommended Dr. Abu Zahra's works, and I think I have about 3 or 4 on my bookshelf, and those are, I think, by way of the fact that I picked them up on a recommendation. And great introductions and books to definitely look at. So yeah, because Dr. Omar is back stateside then in 2000, you're still probably in the process of finishing up your dissertation and your PhD at University of Chicago when he comes back, right?
Well, I started grad school 4 days after 9/11. I started September 15th. I drove to Chicago September 15th, 2001. I remember, and then so I finished in 2006. So between 2001 and 2006, I was especially the first 4 years I lived in Chicago.
So rumor has it that you finished your PhD in record time at the University of Chicago. Is that true? Like, were you the quickest guy?
I think. I mean, I'm not.
That's a rumor I heard.
I'm not. This isn't like. I don't think this is a mark of anything. But yes, I think that I set a record. Or I think it was 5 years. I think either I set the record or I tied the record. I don't know what it is. But it's unusual.
Right.
At University of Chicago, the average is 7 probably years.
Yep.
6 is pretty quick. 5 is very quick. But there's benefits and drawbacks to doing that. I think as time's gone by, I sometimes regret not spending more time doing things that I could have done in grad school that I couldn't do afterwards.
So is that where your focus on Hadith and Hadith studies sort of really emerges as a graduate student?
Yeah, because I was, I was always interested in Hadith from when I first became Muslim. I became Muslim really through reading books like, The Message of the Quran, Muhammad Asad, the Road to Mecca, Muhammad Asad, and the books of Fazl Rahman. And there's not a lot of Hadiths in those books.
Right.
I remember when I first became Muslim, and I think I remember I was at this barbecue at Georgetown, and there was this Lebanese guy, Rabia is his name. He's a very nice guy. And it was the first time I heard about Bukhari and Muslim, and someone told me a hadith, and they said I had to do something because of this hadith, and then the hadith is in Bukhari and Muslim. And I said, what the heck is all this stuff? I mean, I never heard of this. And I think from that moment on, I wanted to, and then of course, as so many of the controversial issues Muslims talk about and deal with and are confronted with are in the hadith. They're not in the Quran. So I think that was always something I had in my mind. But when I applied to do grad school, I applied to study Islamic philosophy.
Okay. And
when I got there was nobody doing Islamic philosophy. I'm not sure why they let me in, but Professor Qadi, I think, must have liked me or something. She must have seen some potential. So then when I got there was actually a guy who was studying hadith. His name is Scott Lucas. He's actually Muslim as well. Yeah. In fact, he and I have a weird life parallel because his mother and my mother were friends growing up. And we had no idea about that until I came home my first year from grad school, and there was this Christmas card on the table, with a picture of a family, and I said, "Why is Scott Lucas in this picture?" My mom said, "That's my friend Ellen Lucas's son." And I said, "Well." So anyway, both of their kids became Muslim. Both of them graduated from University of Chicago.
Yeah.
Both of them married Palestinian women. So odd parallels. And Scott's brother, by the way, wrote the Hangover screenplay. So there you go.
Wow.
Yeah. My reaction as well. Is Scott still at Arizona?
University
John
of
Lucas.
Arizona. Yeah, Jonathan Lucas. Yeah.
Wow, that is fascinating. I mean, it's funny because both of you got both your name and Scott Lucas's name sort of come on my at least as far as just my radar around the same time, and both of you guys I think were finishing up or had just graduated.
Well, he finishes before me, but he got married. Well, yeah, he got married when he was still a PhD student. So this is the difference between Scott and me. I got married when I was 32. He got married when I don't know how old he was. But the point is, I had years and years and years of single life to which to work really hard, and he was married, and so he ended up, we probably ended up publishing around the same amount of stuff, but he was moving at a slower pace because he had all his domestic responsibilities. So that's probably why you think of us being at the same time, because I kind of caught up because of my lack of domestic attachments.
Right. So then going back to what we sort of touched on at the very, very, very beginning, you're in Cairo in 2006 because you're doing CASA at the time. It was like your second stint.
Yeah, CASA too. I'm very grateful for that I was able to do that. This was a wonderful opportunity.
We've mentioned CASA on the show before when Dr. Jackson was on. Yeah. That's the Center for Arabic Studies Abroad. I believe it's a year. It's a year-long.
Yeah, so I did CASA when I applied. So in college at Georgetown, So I applied to CASA, and I had at that time exactly 2 Arabic grades on my transcripts. I mean, I was in the middle of Arabic 2, and I had skipped the second semester of Arabic 1. So I had 0. I mean, I almost knew almost no Arabic when I went to college. I don't know. After that, they never would have let me in. I mean, that was before 9/11, so it was like the last year before 9/11. And there, after that, it got much more competitive, but no one would have let me in. And anyways, I got in, and I went to Cairo from June of 2000 to June of 2001. And because, I mean, it was a great situation for me because I had, with languages, I think it's always better to be in over your head, but I was way over my head. So I had to really learn fast and learn a lot. And that year gave me the skills I needed to really be able to do the things I wanted as a scholar.
Right.
And I also got to meet some scholars in Egypt who would become really, important for my education. Many of them have died or become, let's just say, politically problematic since then.
Mm.
But I certainly learned a lot from their lessons. And anyway, so that's so CASA. But then when you met me, I was doing CASA 2, which is basically a kind of dissertation fellowship where you go and they pay for you to do tutorials with scholars, like one-on-one tutorials. So I did 3 tutorials, 3 or 2, I can't remember. I don't remember now. I think 2 tutorials. One was with a scholar named Muhammad Hamasa, who's since died. He died about a year and a half ago. He was a scholar of Arabic literature at Cairo University. I studied poetry and poetic meters and the sciences of different languages, of the Arabic sciences with him. And then the other one was with the scholar, it was in Hadith, with the scholar named Osama Sayyid Mahmoud al-Azhari, who has since become very famous. But back then, he was
the student of Ali Gumma, right?
Yeah. At the time, he was.
I sat in some durus with him at At
the time, he was getting famous, but he wasn't so famous that you couldn't get his time, and so I was able to get a lot of his time because I was doing this tutorial with him, this kind of formal tutorial, and so I learned a lot in that time with him. And then I also studied other classes while I was there in Egypt as well.
I think besides Egypt, you also do spend time in Yemen. Is that correct? I mean,
I mean, I don't want to make any, I don't want to make any claims. So when you read my bio, to kind of a general audience, they wouldn't infer anything from that. I don't want to, but a Muslim audience would infer that. I don't want to make any claims that are not true, or even, imply anything that's not true. So my Islamic education, which is not very strong. I mean, it's a limited, right? I mean, I learned Arabic. I did study a book called Shadur al-Dhahab in Grammar by Ibn Hisham with Muhammad Hamasa. I studied a book of Fiqh al-Lugha with Ali Juma. And I studied a book of Usul al-Fiqh, legal theory or legal epistemology with a scholar named Sayyid Shaltut in Azhar.
Yes.
I studied about half of a book of Hanbali law with a scholar named Musa Ferber in Cairo.
Right.
I studied a lot of Ulum al-Lugha with Muhammad Hamasa. And I studied a lot of Hadith with Osama Sayyid Mahmoud. So that was really, I went to other places. Like I spent a few months, I think maybe a month and a half in Yemen in 2007. But that was really, and I met a lot of scholars, but I didn't do any extended study. And I was mostly doing manuscript research there. So every other place I've been, I've met scholars and I've benefited from them, and spent maybe a few days with them. But I would not claim to have had any extensive study after that year, 2006. I mean, and I have ijazas to teach some basic things, but not very high level stuff.
Well, and can you talk about? I mean, obviously, the canonization of Al-Bukhari and Muslim, published in 2007. What was the road to that? I mean, the first of several books that you've had published. How did that come about?
So that book, it was kind of answering that question that I had in my mind from that barbecue, which I told you about, right? So, which was, what these two books / entities, these like Bukhari and Muslim. I mean, what are they? Why are they so important? What's their role? What's their place in Islamic civilization? When? Why? How does that happen? And what's their status? Can you criticize them? Can you not criticize them? What's their authority? So that was this dissertation was kind of an answer to that question, and I couldn't believe someone hadn't answered that question before. I mean, I was doing my master's. It was basically a master's thesis. They used to call it a second-year paper. I don't know what it's called now. But I mean, I did it on this scholar who died in 995, common era, named Daraqutni, Ali bin Omar Daraqutni. He's from Baghdad. And he wrote this book where he criticizes about 215 or so narrations from Bukhari and Muslim's books. These are very technical criticisms. They're not, this hadith contradicts the Quran type. I mean, it's very, very technical about certain chains of transmissions about the hadiths. And so I did my thesis on this book and on Daraqutni, and I remember saying, oh, well, I just have to figure out, had these books been canonized or not by that time. I didn't even think about what canonized meant. And I looked around, I was like, no one's actually done this before. So I said, well, that'll be my dissertation then. And that was my dissertation. And Scott Lucas gave me great advice when I started out my dissertation. He told me he wrote his dissertation like a book. He said, I sat down to write a book, not a dissertation. So that's what I did. I said, I'm going to write a book. And, that would mean it's sort of more accessible, broader than a dissertation. And so I said to myself, until someone on my dissertation committee tells me to stop doing that, I'll just keep doing it. And I didn't. No one told me to do anything. And I wrote basically my first book and my dissertation have about one sentence difference between them. And so that was my, it was an attempt to answer, basically how do these two books get to the status they had? What was that status? What was its role? And how has it been changed or contested over time?
I'd love to kind of delve into that a little bit more in terms of like your own studies and expertise. I would submit in terms of hadith. The sort of idea of Islam as an interpretive tradition or hermeneutic, not unlike Judaism or Christianity, with regards to the Old Testament, right? Which is basically, and where hadith or sunnah comes into that as being a sort of an oral tradition that seeks to, provide that interpretive lens to the founding document, which in this case would be the Quran. So if you could maybe perhaps talk a little bit about that, which is not unlike, if we're going to tie other traditions in as well, not unlike American jurisprudence, right? So vis-a-vis the U.S. Constitution, and only difference there being that you rely on legal precedent and prior rulings. So maybe talk a little bit about that. I mean, I'd love to kind of pick your brain on that as well.
Well, this is it. So this has a lot to do with the concept of canonization. And so, of course, like any big term, canonization and canons can mean a lot of different things. But the way I focused on it was the kind of, and I can't believe I actually remember this. It's been so long since I thought about this. But the intersection of texts, community, and authority.
Thank you.
And that's sort of what a canon is. Sort of books that are authoritative for community. And so they're both a way of creating a common kind of authoritative language for that community, but also a way of defining the boundaries of that community through some kind of text, body of work, body of material. So, in the U.S., the decisions, the Constitution, and then the decisions of the Supreme Court, or the Old Testament, and then the New Testament as a lens of reading that through. These are canons. But as you said, I mean, the kind of with interpretive traditions, revealed traditions, and then even some legal traditions, right? You have kind of a original scripture, which is either originally written or very quickly written down, like the Old Testament, the Quran, and then you have this secondary scripture, which comes to explain and control and understand and add to that primary scripture. And that secondary scripture oftentimes, at least in the Abrahamic tradition, is actually not written down for a long time, because when you write something down, you lose control of it. And when something is written, it's subject to misunderstanding. Right. So, Plato has a great line, I think in his Phaedrus dialogue, where he says, books don't, when something is written words they don't teach you, you read what you want into them, right? So if a book doesn't talk to you, talk back to you, it doesn't answer questions, it's almost a tool of the reader.
Right.
And so if you don't have an oral tradition to explain and kind of guide interaction with that book, then the book just becomes a vehicle for misunderstanding. So that's why. But then, of course, the problem is that as time goes on, you also risk losing control or forgetting or not being able to preserve that secondary oral tradition. And so that also has to get written down. And that's what happens in Christianity. That's what happens in Judaism. That's what happens in Islam. That's what happens in even Chinese Zen Buddhism.
Right.
And so this is a typical process. But then, of course, even when you write down that secondary scripture, in Islam's case, it's the Sunnah. Even when you write that down, you still need people to explain what's written. So even no matter what happens, no matter how much you try and set things down on paper to preserve them or to clarify them, you always need living voices to explain and to teach those things.
That's right. So then, wow. I want to get into so much, but so then in your opinion, what is then the Sunnah, right? I mean, we can safely say that the Sunnah is, or the Sunnah. Oh, sorry, what am I trying to say? The repository of the Sunnah is the Hadith. Okay, the repository of the Sunnah is the Hadith literature, right? And we'll get into that in just a second. But what, in your opinion, then is the sort of how would you define Sunnah, right? Is it
the Sunnah? So
the reason I raise that is because I think there's always, would you agree that there's been a tension of sort of isolated Hadith versus normative practice or communal practice, right? Or in the case of the Maliki school and the Medinan school, you've got the Amal of Medina, which is the sort of communal practice that seeks to that provides that lens, right? And then there's the whole existing tension between isolated Hadith versus does that comprise the normative practice? And there's so many examples that Dr. Jackson, I know, talks about, which I think I was listening to a lecture the other day, and I think you actually quoted one of the examples that Dr. Jackson often uses about the husband coming home with a rose for his wife, and every day that's his practice. But on the rare occasions that he doesn't show up at the house, or on the one particular occasion where he shows up at the house without a rose, and someone is there to witness that, that becomes recorded as something that occurred, but that isn't necessarily normative practice. So maybe kind of talk a little bit about that. I mean, I'd love to.
So the general understanding of the Sunnah, the best definition I've heard is from one of my teachers in Egypt, Sheikh Ali Juma, who said it's tatbiqun ma'sumun li kitabillah. It's a infallible application of the Book of God. So the Sunnah is the Prophet's infallible application of the Quran's teachings. So it explains, it applies, it adds to the Quran, and it can also abrogate the Quran.
Right.
If you wanted to kind of just give a shorter definition, you would say that the Sunnah is the Prophet's authoritative precedent.
Okay.
And there's two kind of big debates. Two big questions here.
Yes.
One is, what's the role of the Sunnah in Islam? And until the 20th century, basically, the late 1800s, the early 1900s, no one ever debated that the Sunnah was absolutely essential for understanding Islam. Whether Sunnis or Shiites, whether even Aga Khani, and even Ismailis would say you need the Sunnah to understand the Quran and to understand Islam. They just disagree on what that Sunnah is. Okay, so it's only in the late 1800s, early 1900s that you actually have some Muslim Islamic modernists who say that the Sunnah itself is unnecessary, and I think those claims are internally inconsistent and not sustainable claims. But the second bigger one question then is, what's the interaction between the Quran and the Sunnah? And that's a big generator of kind of discourse in Islamic. A lot of the kind of matter of Islamic tradition is created by this discussion of what's the proper interaction between the Quran and the Sunnah to answer questions about what Muslims should believe and what Muslims should do or not do. Then the second issue is, how do you understand the Sunnah? What makes up the Sunnah? And here you have a couple of different schools of thought. One school of thought is that, the Sunnah is made up of little pieces of information, which are the Hadith. So, what better way to know what the Prophet's authoritative precedent is, alayhi salam, than to just collect little reports about all these different things he said and did and things that were done around him, and then you put that together and you kind of sort which ones are general, which ones are specific, which comes first, which comes later, and then that's the Sunnah. Another answer is no. Another answer is no. The Sunnah is kind of a methodology of problem solving. If you want to think, I think that's the best way to put it. Is that the Prophet ﷺ had a certain way of thinking, a certain way of addressing issues, a certain way of answering questions, and that gets passed on to his companions and to their successors until the early imams like Abu Hanifa and Malik, and that basically fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence is just this application of a tradition of problem solving, and that's the Sunnah of the Prophet. Another approach is to think about, the Sunnah of the Prophet is this communal practice of the Muslim community. How do people learn how to pray? They learn how to pray from their parents. They learned how to pray from their parents. Back, all the way to the Prophet. And that's the kind of Maliki idea of the amal of the people of Medina, the practice of the people of Medina, that the Sunnah is a good way of understanding the Sunnah is through the actual practice of that community that was created by the Prophet and was formed around him. And these, in actuality, every school of law in Islam accepts all three of these to one degree or the other. We associate some of them with, we think of communal practice as Maliki. We think of kind of traditional problem solving of, analogy is more Hanafi, and, Hadith is more Shafi and Hanbali. But in fact, every one of those schools takes every one of the types of thinking of Sunnah that I just gave you. It's just a matter of emphasis that they have, different emphasis.
Right. So then, going back to the idea of the example of sort of the isolated hadith, right? Would you agree that some of the schools then characterize even those isolated reports as being, to use your definition, authoritative precedent of the Prophet, or do they still kind of view those within the overall framework of the corpus of hadith that's out there?
So it really depends on the context. So
okay.
if you have something, let's say you have, the Quran has a lot of verses that deal with inheritance. Mm-hmm. Unlike most other issues of law, Quran actually has a lot to say about that.
And they're very highly technical and
and very specific rules.
That's right.
So very specific rules. So the idea that you can't marry two sisters and you can't marry a woman and her sister. I'm sorry, that's not inheritance, but let's just think about
a family law within the purview of it.
So, in that case, in that case, you're going to probably, let me think about what I'm trying to say a bit more specifically. So what I mean to say is that if you come across a hadith where there's no other evidence, there's nothing in the Quran, there's nothing, that's probably going to play a larger role than something where you have a lot of Quranic evidence. And if you have a lot of different hadiths on an issue, then you're going to have to choose, are some of these reliable and others unreliable? Are some of them specific and some of them general? And if you have an issue where you have, let's say, a hadith that seems to contradict what you have come up with as a general legal principle, then you need to decide, well, are you going to say that the hadith is somehow unreliable or non-representative and you stick with the legal principle? Or do you say, we're going to alter the legal principle? In this case, this is an exception. We're going to say this hadith, we still take the hadith. So what I mean to say is that it really depends on the overall, all the different evidence you're looking at, how much you're going to authorize or how much authority you're going to grant to any one hadith. To give maybe a couple of examples, if you say that, the Quran says, you can't marry a woman and her sister at the same time, and what other than that is permitted for you, the Quran says. So anything other than that is, so in theory, any other, you could marry a woman and her aunt together at the same time. This is assuming, we're talking about men here, not women. But then no, the hadiths prohibit the Prophet, the hadith prohibits someone marrying a woman and her aunt at the same time. Right. And so that you could see that is that a contradiction? The Quran says, any other thing than this is permitted for you. But in fact, these hadiths say, no, actually there's another thing that's prohibited. So you could say, well, this hadith contradicts the Quran, but that's not how Muslim scholars understood that. Almost uniformly, they understood it as an additional restriction.
Correct.
And then, you could actually, and then sometimes you can get a restriction that doesn't even have any basis in Scripture, like the fact that you can't, sorry for those who are listening who can't deal with this stuff, but, if you have a concubine, someone has a concubine, you can't have a concubine and the sister of that concubine as your concubine as well. And there's not any hadiths about that or any. This is just an analogy on the basis of that you can't marry a woman or her sister, therefore you can't have a concubine and her sister as a concubine. In other situations, you have let's say what's called discretionary punishment, or it's called just ta'zir punishment. Right. So this is the vast majority of any punishments carried out in Islamic civilization were ta'zir punishments. Anything that's not a had crime, that doesn't meet the very almost impossibly high evidentiary bar of the hudud crimes, like where you'd have your hand chopped off or something like that, you're going to get punished by had crime. In Islamic civilization, the main form of punishment was some kind of corporal punishment, like lashing or bastonado, or getting your feet hit by the stick or something. And the Prophet says, here you have a couple of different evidence. So the Prophet in one hadith says that there's no lashing above 10 lashes except for a had crime. So that sets this bar. And so in the case of I think in the main opinion in the Shafi'i school, they said you can't go over 10 lashes for a had crime, for a ta'zir crime. In the Hanafi school, they basically said, well, we have these instances of or the companions punishing people, let's say for 39 lashes for intoxication when there wasn't a lot of evidence the person had drunk something. But they would say, okay, so anything that's below the had punishment is an acceptable ta'zir. In the Hanbali school, they stuck much closer to the hadith. So they'd say you can only have 10 maximum of 10 lashes. But then if there's an example of, let's say, one of the companions carrying out a punishment, so let's say one time Omar, the second caliph, lashed a man 99 times for committing adultery. So they say in that case you can do 99. So what I'm trying to say is that you see different approaches. One approach is you just say there's a hadith, that's the rule, we stick to it. Another approach is actually let's look at the early community, and they're actually telling us how to practice this, which is that anything below the had punishment is acceptable. And then the Hanbali school is saying, let's try and come up with a general rule, but then anytime we find, let's stick to the hadith, but anytime we find an early example that differs with that rule, we're going to make an exception for that early example and follow it. So these are different approaches to scripture.
I think just by way of your examples, you raise a lot of the sort of issues that confront at least modern Muslims with regards to the issues of Islamic law that are problematized. And I know you deal with this in your most recent book, Misquoting Muhammad. So I definitely want to get to that. And but before we leave the topic of hadith, I think because you've raised it, and this is one of the things I did want to talk about as well, is we talk about sort of grading hadith, or if a hadith is reliable or weak or forged. Maybe if you could, before we, like I said, pivot away from this topic, talk about the whole sort of enterprise of grading hadith, and maybe where tawatur fits into that. The only reason I raised tawatur is because, I don't know if Jack, the very name of our show is sort of Diffused Congruence, which is like Dr. Jackson's way of sort of explaining the idea of tawatur in Muslim tradition. So I that's the only reason I asked that in particular as well. But maybe kind of tie all that in, and then we'll kind of, like I said, use this to pivot to some of the areas that you cover in your most recent book.
Well, I think that what I just said is really boring. I'm sorry for that. But anyway,
no. I think
example.
to be honest with you and I could get. I feel like I could geek out with you, and we could spend hours. But I don't want to lose our listeners either. So
yeah, so basically the tawatur is I guess one definition I usually use is like massive parallel transmission. So it's this idea that you hear a piece of information so much that it becomes certain to you. Mm-hmm. And the standard example given, in classical books of Islamic epistemology would be, the existence of China. So, I've never been, I guess I went to Hong Kong, but I've never been to China proper. So I don't, for all I know, actually China doesn't exist. I have no direct experience that China exists. But I've seen so many movies and heard so many news stories and blah, 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 that it's impossible. It is an absolute certainty to me that China exists. So this is the kind of the definition of tawatur, which is that it's massively parallel transmission that creates certainty. And here we have to keep in mind that when Muslim scholars elaborate their epistemology, they're doing so after having absorbed kind of the Near Eastern, Greco-Roman, Persian traditions of epistemology and logic. And so they basically do this weird combination where they combine a lot of the details of Islamic law, which they'd already developed, and then an epistemology which is actually totally foreign, and which actually doesn't really match the details of their law. So you have this problem where, let's say the number of hadiths that are transmitted widely enough to meet the standard definitions of tawatur are, maybe one hadith. According to legal theorists. So what is that? So every other hadith is basically doesn't give you certainty, just gives you strong probability of
that's right.
that the Prophet said this statement. Now, that was no problem in law because they said in law you only need strong probability of evidence that in order to construct a law. But in theology, when it comes to talking about the nature of God and things like that, then you're supposed to have certainty because the Quran constantly tells people not to follow dhann, not to follow probability, but to stick to revelation when it comes to the nature of God and how you're supposed to worship God. So they had this problem, which is a lot of the items of Sunni theology which are not in the Quran, like, let's say, the return of Jesus, the coming of the Antichrist, details about the Day of Judgment, things like that. None of these are in the Quran, at least not explicitly in any way.
Right.
And so how can you justify having them as theological tenets if they're not based on epistemologically certain evidence? So they came up with a variety of ways of trying to fix this gap, one of which was to say, well, it doesn't matter if the hadiths are not mutawatir because there's consensus on them, and when the Muslim community comes to consensus on something, it becomes certain. But then the problem is, of course, that the evidence for that belief is itself a hadith, which is not mutawatir. So you have it sort of dissolves into circular argument. So then one argument was that, oh, well, look, it's just people. It's not possible for a whole community to agree on something without it being true, just in general. Like it's if that battle between Superman and General Zod or whatever happened in Metropolis, it's not possible that all these people saw that and it didn't actually happen.
Right. That
so
they colluded.
The entire population of Metropolis saw this battle happening between these two aliens destroying buildings right, left, and center, and there's buildings flying everywhere, and Batman's friends get killed and all this stuff. Then it's not that's not possible that this did not happen.
Right.
So that was sort of the best in the end argument that they could make for the legitimacy of consensus, and then that becomes an argument for taking hadiths that would otherwise be probabilistic and elevating to the level of certainty based on consensus. Of course, the difference is that with consensus on hadiths, you're talking about a relatively small number of scholars coming to consensus on something, not the entire population of the East Coast or something. So when it comes to hadiths, it gets even more complicated because scholars will use the word mutawatir or diffusely congruent hadiths to describe hadiths, even though no one is going to claim they meet the legal theorist's definition of tawatur, diffused congruence. So actually in hadiths, in the study of hadith, there's kind of a parallel jargon where the same term is used, but it doesn't have the same strength. So you'll regularly hear people say, "Oh, that hadith's mutawatir," but what that really means is basically that a lot of Muslim scholars, maybe all, think that it's widely transmitted enough to be certain in its truth, but that doesn't mean that meets the standards of legal theorists. But anyway, that's a separate issue. But I mean, this actually kind of creates an escape valve or an escape route sometimes when Muslim scholars are confronted with hadiths that they can't really accept for one reason or the other. So, a good example of this is in Sahih Muslim. There's a hadith which the Prophet basically tells a man that the man's father is in hellfire, and that then the Prophet says his own father is in hellfire. The problem is that the Prophet's father died before he was born, and so the Prophet never heard about Islam, never had a chance to believe in Islam. He lived in a time when there was no prophecy, when there's no correct religion in Arabia. And one of the principles that Muslim scholars derived early on from the Quran is this idea that, you're not responsible. You're not going to be punished by God for not believing in a religion if you never had a chance to learn about that religion. And so this hadith seems to contradict that. And it's in Sahih Muslim. It's considered to be a sound hadith. But so a lot of scholars would just say, a lot of leading scholars like Asyuti and Bajuri in the 1800s, they just said, well, it's not mutawatir. It's even if it's authentic, it's simply not strong enough to overcome what we consider to be an absolutely certain theological principle, which is that you're not going to be punished for something you didn't have a chance to learn about.
Right. And I think basically, I think, I don't want the listeners to feel as though, like I said, we are getting into the weeds, because I think, at least in my experiences, a lot of the issues that you're talking about, Dr. Brown, are things that that unfortunately, or just sort of Muslim laity, they don't get into these.
No, this is not the weeds. I mean, this is
Yeah,
this is the stuff that people.
Right.
I mean, just the other day, I was
Right.
on some Facebook debate. I get in a lot of these things.
This
guy was saying. I mean, when it comes to issues like apostasy.
Yeah.
So, the Quran says La ikraha fi din. There's no compulsion in religion. So, if you read the Quran, you would say, if someone decides that they're not Muslim anymore, how can that possibly be? They might be making a big mistake, but I mean, if there's no compulsion in religion, then how can you possibly punish them for this decision?
Right.
And then, people say, there's all these hadiths that talk about the death penalty for apostasy, and the answer of the person who says that I don't accept this is that how can you take these hadiths, even if they're in reliable hadith collections, how can you take them as they seem to contradict this principle in the Quran? And kind of the people who defend those hadiths say, well, there's all sorts of things where we allow hadith to supersede the Quran. For example, I'm not allowed to marry my wife and my wife's aunt. I mean, sorry to keep going to that example, but I mean, we already used it. I mean, we don't flip out about that contradicting the Quran, do we? I mean, so but then people would say, so I think actually these issues are behind a lot of the big debates Muslims have that,
Agreed.
On the news and in their daily lives. So that's really, that's why I got into studying this stuff, is because of these debates all end up going back to these very in the weeds questions.
I agree. Which I think serves as a great segue, if any, to kind of talk about a lot of these issues that you do talk about, that are in the news, that are often problematized, in especially for Muslims living in the West, or just by Western audiences, or our Western interlocutors, in terms of the type of issues that you talk about in Misquoting Muhammad. So maybe talk a little bit about the sort of genesis of that book, and I can't help but mention the fact that the Misquoting Muhammad is sort of a play on who was it, Bert Ehrman's book, right? Misquoting Jesus, right? Which he was a New Testament scholar. Maybe kind of talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, so that's that was the suggestion of the publisher. They said, Bart Ehrman wrote this book, Misquoting Jesus. You should write one called Misquoting Muhammad. I said, I don't really want to, because his books are about, how
right.
Jesus no one originally thought he was God. He was this radical preacher. And I mean, I don't have anything against his scholarship, but I don't agree with that approach to early Islamic studies, because
right.
I don't think that we have any evidence for these type of claims about the early Islamic period, and instead we just sort of indulge our own narrative that early Islam must be like early Christianity, even though we don't have any evidence for that. So right. I was like, I don't want to write that book, but the editor said, well, okay, then write it more like contesting Muhammad, contesting his legacy. Oh, I was like, okay, that's actually sounds something I could write. But anyway, that's the title. But for me, the real title of the book is the subtitle, which is what was it?
Challenge and choices.
Challenge and choices of interpreting the Prophet's legacy.
Yeah.
So this really came out of a lot of just giving lectures, especially public lectures, in the first couple of years that I was a professor, and realizing I was end up dealing with the same issues over and over again, and I wanted to kind of put these out there for people to read about, and I wanted to do it in a way that was accessible and well written, and kind of almost with a narrative that you could identify with, and characters and things like that. So I don't know if you read the book The Mantle of the Prophet by Roy Mujahideen.
Yeah.
So it was really kind of like, I wanted to make it like a Sunni Islam version of the Mantle of the Prophet. So that's what I set out to do.
I see.
And
right.
And then so there's all sorts of, if you want to talk about how you understand scripture and debates over hadiths and the Quran and stuff. And to get into this, you have to give the person a background of Islamic intellectual history. And I wanted this book to be readable by anybody.
Right.
And so the first main chapter is actually kind of a history of Islam. It's like a history of Islamic intellectual history up until the early modern period. And that's there to give background, to sort of introduce all the concepts that someone would need if they read the rest of the book. And then the other parts of the book deal with kind of Islamic hermeneutics, scriptural interpretation, the challenge that faces with the advent of modernity and the confrontation with the modern West, the different splintering sort of schools of thought that Muslims splinter into in meeting this challenge, and then some of the bigger questions about truth and reality that come from the Islamic scriptural tradition.
Yeah, I mean, I can't recommend it enough. It's a wonderful addition to, I think, any certainly any Muslim living in the West in terms of like sort of tackling or how the book sort of tackles how Muslims have historically navigated, their fidelity to the tradition through changing sort of times and modernity and other things that they're having to deal with, and you do so within the context of some of the most sort of controversial and contentious issues, according to Muslims and Western audiences. So I highly recommended. If we could sort of leave out, I know we've talked a lot, and I don't want to take too much more of your time, but perhaps to sort of close out, in terms of the book, really quickly, I know that one of the areas that you also talk about is sort of modern reformist movements, and some violent, some not so violent, but we talk about sort of the Salafist, the Salafi approach, as well as violent extremist groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda, Boko Haram, etc., where I think what you're essentially saying in the book is that they're quoting Muhammad accurately. So they're not misquoting Muhammad, to draw on the title of the book, but they're doing so in a highly truncated manner. Right, which is sort of stripped of any sort of modern, that's sort of stripped of the entire edifice of the Muslim tradition, 1400 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so what results is a prophet that is just seen as this sort of,
So I think one of the problem, I mean, let's forget about Salafist or not Salafist. I actually don't think that Salafism is really just a kind of modern sort of Hanbalism. It's not. I don't think Salafis are that different from other people in the sense that the stuff you're talking about. What I would say is that that when we talk about violence groups, really I think it's not really about a specific approach to scripture. It's more the way that we understand the role of Islamic law in society. And what I mean by that is, if you, in theory, and a great example of this is there's this he's a Moroccan scholar. He's from Morocco originally, but he ends up visiting what's today like Timbuktu in the early 1500s, a scholar named Maghili. And he basically goes there, and he's sort of very kind of doctrinaire, ivory tower, Orthodox Muslim scholar. And he goes there, and the king of Mali says, my people are Muslim, but the women walk around naked until they're married, and they don't divide their inheritance by Islamic law, and they et cetera, et cetera. What should I do? And he says, oh, well, you just tell them to do that, or you have to kill them. I mean, his point being, if you deny something that is known essentially to be part of Islam, then you're an unbeliever. That's the standard Muslim position, right? So if, for example, I say I don't have to pray 5 times a day, that would make me an unbeliever because I'm denying something that is absolutely known as part of the religion. So if these people in Mali say we don't have to divide our inheritance by Islamic law, then they're technically not Muslims. And if they were previously Muslims and now they're not Muslims, then they are apostates and they should be killed. That's the thinkers, the scholars' logic. And everything he's saying is correct technically, right? But it's, of course, completely, it is not taking consideration at all the context, which is that these people have very little understanding of their religion. It's seeped very little into their culture, and that, that's not how you educate people. So, I mean, a lot of times people think that, extremism comes from, or some violent extremism. I don't like the term extremism because extremism just means ideas that are unpopular, and what is unpopular or popular in any one given place and time has absolutely no necessary link to anything that's actually morally wrong or violent or anything like that. But I mean, let's just say violent extremism. The violent extremism sort of comes from misreading of text or misreading of scriptures. And I think that's, a lot of the times that's not the case. I think that it's more a failure to understand how, or to take, let's say, a productive approach of implementing rules in society and implementing kind of orthodox understandings of law in a society that might be, very far off from that understanding. And I mean, I always think a great example of this is in the late 1400s. There's this Moroccan scholar who's, very kind of standard Orthodox, intellectual alim, from Morocco, and he travels to to Timbuktu, and he basically has this meeting with the Sultan of Timbuktu, who's this very powerful man named Misquoting Muhammad, but who's also very religiously devout, and he's kind of committed to trying to bring his people, who are nominally Muslim, trying to bring them more actually into a practice of Islam at a society-wide level. And so he's telling the Moroccan scholar's name is Al-Maghili, Muhammad al-Maghili. He starts telling him, my people do this, and they don't divide up their inheritance according to Islamic law, and the women walk around naked until they get married, and they go and they look at, they seek out soothsayers, and they go and they say, the fox said this and the duck said that, or whatever. And he asked the scholar what does that mean and what should you do about it? And the scholar basically says, well, that's all kufr, and basically if you tell them that this is not Islamic, if they have to stop, if they don't stop, then you basically are entitled to kill them because they've denied things that are essentially part of the religion of Islam. And that's technically correct. But it completely fails to realize the social reality of these people's religious lives, right? They're Muslim nominally, okay, but if you go and you tell them that they have to change the way they're living, or they have to change the way they divide up their inheritance, and that's just what Islam says, that doesn't convince them. Nobody's ever convinced when someone just comes and starts telling them what to do. You have to ease them into why this is the way they have to do it, why they have to accept this understanding, what the Quran is, what the Sunnah is, how these sources work. You have to ease people into understanding of their religion. You can't just go and sort of caulk this orthodox view of the world on top of them and then say that they're denying it if they don't accept it. I mean, that's not how human beings work. And so what you see is, in these, like, the kind of movements of revival and reform which shake the Muslim world in the 1700s, like this is not a technically accurate term, but people call it the Wahhabi movement in Central Arabia, or the Sokoto Caliphate in what's now mostly northern Nigeria, and also the movement of Shah Wali Allah in India and Sanani in Yemen. Like, these movements, they all have similar ideas about getting Muslims to go back to, or maybe even learn for the first time, the true practice of their religion, and not engage in worshiping idols or things like that, or to really kind of revive Islam in these places. But if you look at movements like the Wahhabi movement, their ideology, they basically go and they say, they'll go to a tribe and they'll say, okay, you guys have to start practicing Islam as we see it because we have the correct version, and you guys are actually worshiping trees and rocks, which they were, okay, and you guys are actually not Muslim, even though you think you are. And by the way, they were not Muslim according to any rational standard. I mean, they were really worshiping trees and rocks, and there's a lot of these tribes in Central Arabia. And basically go and tell them, accept our da'wah, or we're going to kill you because you claim to be Muslims and you're actually kafirs, so you can be, you're effectively apostates. You're like the mushrikeen that the Prophet fought, ﷺ, during his time. And the Quran gives you permission to fight them. I mean, remember, they were really actually in the exact same place the Prophet was, fighting exactly the same thing he was fighting, namely the mushrikun of Central Arabia. So that you look at that attitude, and as opposed to basically saying, let's say, the attitude of someone like Shah Wali Allah, which was, we have to educate people. We have to educate. I mean, we can't just go and if you go to a group, especially a group of Bedouins who are really proud people who don't like being told what to do. Okay, you go and you tell them, you guys are totally wrong in the way you're understanding everything. You need to do the things our way, or we're going to fight. I mean, what do you think? How do you think they're going to react? How do you think people usually react to that? So I think a lot of the time that extremism isn't really about I've derived a rule from Scripture that is wrong. We actually might agree on that rule. It's just, how do you actually get people to follow that rule? Do you sort of go and beat them over the head with it, or do you educate them into an understanding of it? And I think that's a lot of times in Islamic history and today, extremism, sort of unacceptable or violent extremism, isn't about someone having a bad belief. It's about someone not understanding how to implement that belief in a society.
Correct. So in terms of approach, what is the approach towards reform?
Exactly. Just as another counterexample, in what became really the dominant approach to teaching Islam in West Africa, and this was started in the 1400s and 1500s. I think it was called the Jakanke system, developed in places like Senegal and Mali in that time period. They had a couple of really important premises. One was that people, kufr exists or disbelief exists because of ignorance, not because of evil. Right. So if people are not doing something wrong, it's because they're ignorant. It's not because they're bad. Or it's not because they're intentionally denying something. And the main job of scholars is to educate them. First and foremost, you go and educate. You don't force. You don't compel. You don't even take political power. You go even and live under non-Muslim chiefs and rulers, and you basically try and educate people about Islam until they get to the point where they start practicing and understanding what the duties and requirements that they have are.
And I think what further complicates this whole, these, let's say, seemingly opposite approaches is that both seem to be able to justify their approach by the sources.
I mean, I think so, but it's a very this maybe is a good example of kind of bad interpretation. I mean, the only place that I know of, and I've looked around a lot, that Muslims are actually allowed to force people to basically convert or die is the case of the mushrikun of Central Arabia, the polytheists of Central Arabia. Everyone else is, even polytheists outside of Arabia, like let's say Hindus or something like that, or the animist religions of West Africa, they were treated as people of the book, which meant that you couldn't force them to convert to Islam or die. The second issue is, this question of people, and this is actually something that's I think coming up today, is this idea of people denying things that are known essentially as part of the religion, or axiomatic tenets of the faith. In Arabic, it's al-ma'lum min ad-din bid-durura. These are things that are known essentially as tenets of, like, for example, there's one God, there's a day of judgment, there's angels, the Quran, the finality of the Prophet, there's 5 prayers, zina is haram, intoxication is haram. These things everybody says. And if you drink alcohol, you're just a bad Muslim. I mean, you could drink alcohol every day until you pass out, and then you're just a bad Muslim. But if you say, I'm allowed to drink alcohol,
correct,
then that would be denying something that's known essentially as part of the religion. And the agreement of Muslim scholars, present or as far back as we know, is that if you do that, then you've left Islam.
Mm-hmm.
So if you didn't, so the problem is that if you take something like, two things. One thing like hijab, and the other thing being, let's say, homosexual relationships. So, or let's just say liwat, just sodomy. Let's just take that as an example because it's very clear. So, every Muslim scholars, all schools of law, across Sunni and Shiism, all thought that women were required to cover their hair when they're out in front of strange men. And all also believe that sodomy is prohibited. So if you go and say that hijab is not required and sodomy is permitted, then that's actually denying things that are known essentially as part of the religion. But of course, we look around today in the Muslim community, in almost anywhere in the world, and there's lots of people, women and men, who don't think that the hijab is required and who do think that homosexuality is permissible. So the question is, do you say you guys have ceased to be Muslim because you believe this, or do you, which is technically be correct, or do you say, let's look at basically what has led us into this cultural situation, right? So in the case of the hijab, you have colonial experience, you have all sorts of discourse about gender and interpretation, and people advancing arguments that the hadiths on it are unreliable, and the Quranic verses are unambiguous, and it's actually just preaching modesty. So at this point, something like that, it's I would actually argue that it's not really an axiomatic tenet of the religion anymore. It's actually something that's been, even though maybe that debate isn't very solid, it's actually become a real issue of debate, and that people can believe that hijab is not required and not have kind of exited the bounds of religion. And this another interesting thing. When you look
That's
at
fascinating.
Like,
so you're saying like things that are things that would traditionally be seen as non-negotiables, right? Like for example, to simplify your term,
exactly.
Non-negotiables can over time, based on the fact that now the community, because of, let's say, context, whatever the reasons may be, are now having conversations around how non-negotiable is that non-negotiable.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that actually has any merit, right? So, I feel bad using hijab as an example but let's take my point is that lots of, let's say, Muslim girls grow up today in devout Muslim households with devout Muslim parents, and every aspect of their religion they're extremely serious about, and they believe that it's not required for them to wear hijab. And so at that point, I think that you can say that whether or not you agree with their position, you can't just say, oh, you're denying something that's a non-negotiable, therefore you've actually left Islam. At that point, that simply becomes, even though that might technically be true historically, if you insist on saying that today, you're simply denying what has become a cultural reality that you need to deal with. And if you want to convince these girls and these boys that hijab is required, then you're going to actually have to go and kind of win back that ground.
That's
through the process of education and argumentation.
Like the market, enter the marketplace of ideas, as it were.
You can't, exactly.
Let me ask you then finally, because that's a great example, and I know one that, fill in the blank, whether it's hijab, whether it's homosexuality, whether it's even as simple as like participating in Western, liberal democracy, whatever may be the case, right? Notions of citizenship. How much of what you're talking about relates to this issue of ijma and the idea that ijma, or consensus, has been an ambiguous term through Muslim tradition? That is to say that even the scholars couldn't agree on a universal definition of ijma, of consensus. One, would you agree with my assessment of that?
Yeah, I think that, look, if you really want to say the things that are there's ijma on, and this is what Imam Shafi'i says, and this is what Ahmed ibn Hanbal says in effect, and numerous scholars have said since then, which is that ijma is on the core issues. Al-ijma' ala al-usul laysa al-furu', right? So ijma' is on the basic principles, core principles, not on details. Then that's and so the things that someone like Imam Shafi'i would say there are there is ijma on is things like 5 daily prayers, zina is prohibited, alcohol is prohibited, right? Fasting and Ramadan is required. So these are things that are really not going to get debated by anybody. So that's why, by the way, that the things that you can believe, that if you don't believe them will cause you to leave Islam, are very few in number, because there's very, very few things that scholars can point to and say, yes, everybody agrees that this is part of the religion. So that's why, a lot of, ijma is historically a tool that Muslim scholars will use to beat other people over the head with. How can you say this? This
Precisely.
is, there's ijma on this. I mean, 90%. There's one scholar in the early 1000s named Abu Ishaq al-Isfaraini, from Shafi scholar from northern Iran. He says, that the number of things people have claimed ijma on is something like 10,000 different points. I mean, this is absolute nonsense. But so, I tend to, I might have a, ijma filter. So, if someone starts saying ijma about something, if it's not actually something where there's consensus, then I kind of tune out at that point.
That's right. And I think typically, whether it's that particular example you gave, or really throughout Muslim history, what have been sort of termed sort of or compiled into say a work, or like Kitab al-Ijma' versus Kitab al-Ikhtilaf, for example, right? Which is far more voluminous than Kitab al-Ijma', like stuff that's been
exactly
or is in consensus. So anyway, I want to pivot a little bit. Thank you so much I think it's just been an illuminating conversation. And again, I urge the listeners to check out Jack's books and check out Dr. Brown's writings. And I think that there's just a lot of the conversations that we've been having on the podcast will be further elucidated there. I want, if I could, to kind of maybe bring our conversation and to conclude our conversation by talking about something that is sort of has now become kind of a hot button issue, but nonetheless is something that I know that you have personally, have sort of dealt with and have talked about and discussed, and that's sort of the Muslim view and approach towards the sort of BDS movement and where the sort of MLI initiative and program kind of fits into that. And I'd love to kind of have you talk about it, because I know that's something that you are sort of passionate about, and it would be really, I think, enlightening for our listeners.
Well, I think, this is a big deal.
Yeah.
I think that, and it's a big deal for me because.
And feel free to flesh out. I mean, I was free to be
basically for anybody who's listening and doesn't know about this, so this thing called the Muslim Leadership Initiative, which was started by this chaplain at Duke named Abdullah Antepli, who is a senior member of the Gulen movement in America, if anyone's interested in that. I just think that's actually not irrelevant, considering that movement has historically been very, very interested in building strong relationship with Israeli governments.
Right.
It was between him and then this organization an institution in Israel called the Shalom Hartman Institute, which is actually a very conservative institute in Israel, which is very pro-army, and during the Gaza war a couple years ago, issued lots of statements in support of the Israeli army. And basically the idea was you take young Muslims, prominent young Muslims, and you take them to Israel to learn about Zionism and learn about Judaism and stuff like that. Now, actually, as Sana Said, who at the time was an independent journalist but wrote this article for the Islamic Monthly, as she revealed in an incredibly important article, which maybe you can, put a link to or something in this. I think it was called Faithwashing or something.
Yeah.
She showed that the Shalom Hartman Institute had actually created this initiative, or had engaged in this initiative, for the purposes of undermining the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divest, Sanction movement. Now, if anyone doesn't know what this is an international movement that was spearheaded by Palestinian civil society, and which has been received almost unanimous endorsement by Palestinian civil society, that to for people to engage in international boycott of Israeli institutions and goods and services, and to divest from investment in Israeli companies and institutions. So this move's actually been very successful. If anyone's been following this, I counted it at least last year. Maybe it's now there's been more, but as of last year, there were, in the last couple of years, there were 7 standalone articles in The Economist about BDS. I mean, this is something that's really, and you can see how states like New York State, New York City, other municipalities and areas in the United States have actually passed laws or regulations trying to ban BDS. France actually criminalized BDS. So in France, Je suis Charlie, freedom of expression, etc. If you actually wear a T-shirt saying boycott Israel, that's a crime. It's actually a crime in France. And that was upheld by the French courts as of October 2015.
That's correct.
Now, so this is a very effective movement, and you can tell how effective it is because of the amount of feathers it ruffles and the amount of kind of reactions it provokes. And it's been more effective than anything else, in my opinion, in kind of putting pressure on Israeli government policies. Now, so this movement, MLI, was designed to undermine this movement. So it was to take young Muslims, American Muslims, and basically make them undermine this movement. And not only that, but become exemplars of this. Think about this. This is called Muslim Leadership Initiative. This is an initiative to create Muslim leaders. Now, forget about the fact that it's absolutely ridiculous that any community will have its leadership selected by outside actors who, let's just say, probably don't have the best interests of the Muslim community in mind. Okay, forget about the fact that that's just on its face a ridiculous concept that no one should accept. This is actually, if you care about Palestinian issue, okay, which all these people who went on MLI say they do, okay, if you actually want to do what Palestinians want you to do to help them, they've said, we want you to support BDS. And when these MLI people went to Israel, they met Palestinian leaders and they all said, please don't do this, please support BDS. So these people who went on MLI ignored this because they were getting a nice gravy train ride into the good graces of American public square. Now, why is MLI so bad? One, it is designed to undermine BDS. Okay. 2, it actually undermines BDS. 3, it's Muslims who are undermining BDS. Now, mind you, there's all these non-Muslims, like the Presbyterian Church, like a lot of Unitarian churches, like elements of the Quaker Church, like Jewish Voices for Peace, like scientists like Stephen Hawking. About a year and a half ago, around 200, 300, I can't remember the exact number of British academics published an article or an advertisement in, I think it was in the Times or the Independent, saying, we argue for a boycott of Israel. I mean, there's all these non-Muslims, even
as a Pink Floyd fan, Roger Waters.
Exactly, Roger Waters. Okay, 2015, one of the most read articles in the Washington Post was an article by 2 Jewish professors, one from Harvard, one from MIT, and the title of the article was, I think, "We are 2 Jews and lifelong Zionists, and we're calling for the boycott of Israel." So that was one of the most read articles in the Washington Post that year, 2015. So you can give that link to the listeners or whatever. So all these people, Jews, Christians, atheists, Buddhists, rock stars, non-rock stars, scientists, they're all coming out saying we support BDS. Who's the ones who are going against BDS and undermining it now? It's young Muslims. Think about that disgrace. Now, Black Lives Matter leadership has come out supporting BDS. Mm-hmm. And who's against it? Who's undermining it? It's young Muslims. And not only, by the way, young Muslims, but young Muslims who are very coincidentally now very prominent young Muslims. Isn't that interesting? You know, I find that to be fascinating. Okay, and I'll also go to say I'm not going to name any names, but I'm not sure all these people, let's just say, have the normal amount of skill required to occupy the place they do.
the space that they do, right?
No, I mean, that's just my opinion. I can't prove that. That's I mean, somebody likes somebody's writing, other person doesn't like their writing. God knows a lot of people don't think that John Tesh should have been as famous as he was. Remember John Tesh?
Of course.
Okay, I don't
Started off
no
the Entertainment Tonight, correct? Yeah.
But then he had that weird piano career or something.
Yes,
anyway.
he did.
Okay,
and now he's on, I think, a late night radio. Talk show.
You can put this on as a link too for your listeners. But my point is that where are Muslims going to be on this issue? The world is moving. The world is the situation is changing on the Israel-Palestine issue. The Israeli apartheid policies are becoming more and more obvious to more and more people. And are Muslims going to be on the right side of that, which they always were, or are they going to be on the wrong side? Right. So that's the third. I think either the second or the third major problem. The fourth major problem is that again, there has been basically since 9/11. An attempt by the main, I'll say, power elite establishments of American life in the government and civil society. There has been an attempt to create an established good Islam. And there's a great article by a professor in Stanford, I think it's 2011 issue of Stanford Law Review, on creating an establishment Islam. Establishing Islam as a religion. I think I have to get the title for you. But basically, this author just goes through. It's now even it's probably 4 or 5 years old now, the article. But he basically goes through and he shows how there's all this effort by American, let's say, philanthropic organizations, American government, to create moderate Islam.
This
Islam
sort of good Muslim narrative.
Depoliticized, politically neutered Muslims,
quietist, pacifist. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, who basically just now fall just squarely within the center part of the Democratic Party.
Absolutely.
Now, think about this. Why as an American, it's my right to have political views. If I don't like American foreign policy, I have every right as an American to say I don't like this policy. If I think that there's a policy that's better for America domestically, I can go and I can advocate for that policy. Okay? The only people who are not allowed to do this are Muslims. They're the only people who are not allowed to have political opinions.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Mm-hmm. Unless they want to get up and say, my son died in Iraq and I believe in the Constitution. I'm not trying to criticize the Khan family, but I think it's really telling that the only political statement Muslims can make is that they are willing to go and fight in the army and die in unjust wars.
Correct.
I mean, that's pretty pathetic, right? That just sort of blind militarism is the only political act we can engage in. Mm-hmm. By the way, where are Muslims now actually not politically neutered anymore? It's Muslims who engage in things like Black Lives Matter. Muslims who people like Omar Suleiman or people like Linda Sarsour, who are out there as now you might want to say kind of left progressive activists. Now, all those organizations also support BDS. Right? They don't go on faith-washing trips to Israel. So my point is that when my main concern about MLI is not the Palestinian issue. It's not what's the most effective way to change Israeli policy. That's important to me. But for me as an American Muslim, the absolute most important thing is that young Muslims cannot think. I don't want them to think that the path forward, the path to respectability, the path to influence, is through these establishment routes that have been laid out for them.
Yeah.
That's not, you should not take the path of the people who are offering you money, offering you ease, and all they're asking of you is to compromise on political positions. That's not something that Americans are required to do.
Yeah. I myself couldn't think of the name, or I don't know which article you were referencing from the Stanford professor, but I know this is something that Dr. Jackson, for example, Dr. Sherman Jackson, he calls the domestication of religion in America, right? And one of the things that I think often people fail to see or fail to realize is that as we recognize that one of the cardinal principles outlined for us in the Constitution is the separation of church and state, a lot of times that conversation tends to revolve around the fact that, okay, we don't want sort of the official establishment we don't want an establishment of an official religion by the state. But it's not just so much, the conversation usually tends to revolve around protecting the state from religion. But I think that also a salient feature of that is to protect religion, the integrity of religious expression, from state interference. And I think precisely the kind of what you're talking about in terms of like the establishment of the good Muslim narrative, these various think tanks and government agencies and so on that are presenting this narrative as what is moderate Islam, or what is, what is the good Muslim, is precisely the kind of dangers that the sort of founders were warning against in terms of this sort of intertwined relationship between church and state.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be very clear. Like, I think if young Muslims want to go learn about Judaism, that's great. If they want to learn about Zionism, that's great. Okay, if they want to engage in dialogue with Jews and Zionists and whatever, that's great. You can do that anywhere. You can do that in New York. You can do that in Washington, D.C. You can do that in Zurich, in Switzerland. You can do it in Tahiti, for all I care. But the fact that this was being held, and in fact, the organizers insisted it was held in Israel. I heard of this from one of the organizers themselves. It was insisted that it was held in Israel. Should reveal what the actual purpose is.
Right.
The purpose is to force people to break the boycott and going there. Yeah. And Muslims need to. I'm really sometimes astounded by the naivete of Muslim leaders of around my age. Mm-hmm. These guys who are always complaining about uncles and aunties. I sometimes feel that uncles and aunties are much more profoundly, they're able to think in like 3 and 4 dimensions. A lot of these young people my age, I'm just like, are you actually this naive, or are you just perpetuating this naivete because it allows you to make the kind of choices you make? I mean, when people say, well, like this mosque near my house just issued a couple weeks ago, this poor guy got arrested by the FBI for, material support of terrorism. And, first of all, he just was arrested. So he's just presumed innocent. Presumed innocent. Second of all, he probably didn't do anything anyway. Third of all, we all only know the track record on these issues. They issued a thing, thanking the FBI for arresting him. I was like, what in God's name? Like, do you issue things for the FBI thanking them for arresting, a drug dealer the other day? You're issuing. Who does this? Who actually issues, press releases thanking someone for going into their community and probably provoking a crime? And by the way, why didn't that mosque issue something saying we support this person's family? We're there for them to help them in this tough time.
Right.
So, and people don't even bat eyelids at this anymore. This is how Muslims have been. They've really been beaten into this. They've been beaten into positions of subordination where they don't even assert their rights as Americans. As Americans, you don't have to write thank you notes to the FBI for arresting somebody.
That's right.
That's their job.
This is just subordination apologetics writ large. Yeah, absolutely. No, I really appreciate your comments, Jack, especially on this issue of MLI. And for full disclosure, I know we talked off air about this. For our listeners, we've had previous guests on the show. We don't need to go into names. You can go back and listen to those episodes who have either themselves been a part of certain MLI cohorts or regardless have written or spoken in favor of them. And so I felt it was our duty to, at the same time, to feature someone who offers a passionate alternative voice to that narrative. So I really want to thank you for that, and thank you for putting it on the record, as it were.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you for the entire episode. We're going to go ahead and wrap. Jack, it's been really a pleasure. Where can people find you online, perhaps engage you if they're interested in doing so?
Well, I guess I have a Facebook page.
Okay.
And now I'm on Twitter, although I have an agreement with my wife, which is that she has to approve everything I want to tweet. Because the reason I didn't go on Twitter until now is because my mouth is really huge. I mean, I really I'm not
we'd be remiss not to we'd be remiss not to mention your wife, Layla Larian, who herself.
Yeah, she's a star.
She's a rock star. We need to have her on the show. So
yeah, she's a Peabody award-winning journalist and RFK Journalism award-winning journalist and 2-time Emmy nominee.
I didn't.
Yeah, she's the.
I didn't know what the Emmy.
She hasn't won it yet. She hasn't won an Emmy yet, but she's at. Yeah. So no. So anyway, yeah. So then also
you're on Twitter, but it's subject to approval from.
And then also you can email me at my just Google Jonathan Brown Georgetown or something like that. You'll find my email address. Or that's probably the best way to get in touch with me.
Wonderful. And in terms of sort of forthcoming books, articles, anything that you want to maybe kind of drop a hint for the audience?
Well, sure. I'm almost done with a book on. It's called. What's it called? Islamic Justice and Islamic Law, Madhalim Courts, the Ulama, and Legal Reform. And it's me and actually another author, a guy named Guy Burak. We co-authored this book, and it looks at it's a history of looking at this issue of what happens when legal systems and notions of justice are not in sync, or what happens when you have a legal system or a legal process that gives you a result that you don't consider to be just. So this is actually something Muslims think about a lot, if you think about it. So that book will hopefully, we're almost done with it. Hopefully it will come out. And then what else? I'm doing this translation of the 6 books, which I'm the head of a project to do that. With 6 books of hadith along with commentary, and that'll be online.
I heard about
but
that. I heard about that. Are you working with some other people on that?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Several. Is Joe? Is Joe
Bradford? He's translating some of it. Another guy named Abdurrahman is translating.
Okay.
So there's a couple of us.
Joe because we had you on the show about 3 episodes ago.
Oh, he's a very learned person. He's a very learned person.
He is. An old friend from Houston of mine, someone who had the privilege of knowing, and just a stand-up guy. So I want to make sure,
Yeah, so that's that.
Him again. Yeah.
That project will, I hope it'll be done. I try not to think about it, but I hope it'll be done in the near future. But it's massive, but it will also be it'll be inshallah, the most important thing I ever do, hopefully. So I'm very happy to be.
Inshallah, God willing, and among many others. It's going to be a monumental work, just from what I've seen online and heard Joe mention, as well as yourself. So thank you so much for all of that. I'm going to turn it over to Zeki now to close this out. People can leave us a review on iTunes, wherever they download podcasts.
Also send emails to diffusedcongruence@gmail.com. Also be sure to hit like on our Facebook page, facebook.com/diffusedcongruence. Leave us a star rating, leave a review. Spread the word. Every little bit helps. And, the amount of feedback we've gotten over the past several years has been tremendous, but just more than anything else, word of mouth. Telling people you dig the show, turning them onto it, introduce them to an episode that you like, it all really helps. So big thanks for being such a great audience, and we hope you will stick with us for future episodes, and we will be back very shortly with our next one. This is Diffused Congruence. Until then.